The rain fell in sheets across the Montana wilderness, each drop striking the wooden bridge like a tiny hammer. Lightning split the night sky, illuminating the scene in stark, terrible clarity. A man hung suspended from the bridge, his body inverted wrists bound with rough rope that cut into his flesh. With each passing minute, the creek below him swelled the once gentle water now churning with violent purpose. The cold liquid had already reached his shoulders. Soon it would claim his mouth, his nose. His eyes were wide with the knowledge of his approaching death. In the distance, a woman ran through the downpour, her dress heavy with rain and mud. Her breath came in desperate gasps as she stumbled down the embankment toward the bridge. Eleanor Wade's auburn hair was plastered to her face, her eyes fixed on the hanging figure of her husband. "Gabriel." The word tore from her throat, barely audible above the storm's fury. The hanging man twisted at the sound of his name, eyes finding her in the darkness. "Eleanor, no go back." She ignored him, pressing forward. 20 yards from the bridge, something whistled through the air. Eleanor felt it before she heard it, a sudden searing pain as an arrow punched through her shoulder blade. The impact drove her to her knees, a scream escaping her lips as her fingers instinctively reached for the shaft protruding from her back. On a ridge overlooking the grim tableau, a lone horseman watched through a brass spyglass. Mason Reeves lowered the instrument, his weathered face impassive save for the muscle working in his jaw. 58 years of hard living had etched deep lines around his eyes, yet they remained sharp, taking in every detail of the scene below. A gunshot cracked through the storm. Mason's horse shifted nervously beneath him. Then darkness claimed the world. 12 hours earlier. The Broken Spur Saloon was like 100 others Mason Reeves had encountered across the frontier, a place where men came to forget or be forgotten. Whispering Pines was barely a town, just a collection of wooden buildings huddled together against the vast Montana wilderness, as though seeking safety in numbers. Mason sat alone at a corner table, nursing a glass of whiskey. At 58, his clothes were trail-worn but clean, his gray-streaked hair cropped short beneath a battered cavalry hat. Most men gave him a wide berth, sensing something in his stillness that warned of danger. "They say you were a sharpshooter in the war," said a voice to his right. Mason didn't look up. "They say a lot of things. They say you can hit a playing card at 100 paces. Mason finally raised his eyes. A young cowhand stood before him, liquor-brave and foolish. "What they don't say is how I don't like being bothered when I'm drinking." The cowhand opened his mouth to reply, but a shadow fell between them, a small ancient woman with skin like tanned leather and eyes as black as obsidian. The locals called her Ista. The white settlers considered her a witch. The remaining native people said she walked between worlds. "This one has important business elsewhere," Ista said to the cowhand, her voice carrying a weight beyond her years. "Don't you, boy?" The young man's face clouded with confusion, then fear. He nodded quickly and retreated to the bar. Ista slid into the chair across from Mason uninvited. "You have death hanging over you, Mason Reeves." Mason snorted. "Death's been hanging over me since '63. Nothing new there." "Not your death." Ista's gnarled fingers traced patterns on the scarred tabletop. "Today you will meet a woman wounded by an arrow. Your fate is bound to hers." Mason stared at her, then drained his whiskey in one swallow. "Lady, I haven't seen an arrow wound since the Blackfoot raids 5 years back." Ista reached into the folds of her shawl and produced an arrow, beautiful in its craftsmanship, the shaft decorated with intricate symbols. She placed it on the table between them. "Take this. When the time comes, do not pull it out. Push it forward." Mason made no move to touch the arrow. I don't believe in fortune-telling. And yet, fortune believes in you. Ista rose to her feet with surprising grace for one so old. The past is not finished with you, Mason Reeves. What was buried at Valley Forge is about to resurface. Mason's hand shot out, gripping her wrist with unexpected force. What did you say? His voice had dropped to a dangerous whisper. You heard me, soldier. Ista showed no fear, only a deep sadness. The man who killed your family walks in daylight, thinking all witnesses are dead. He doesn't know about the eagle that watches from above. Mason released her as though burned. The saloon around them continued its rowdy existence, oblivious to the charged moment between them. Take the arrow, Ista repeated. When blood falls like rain, remember, push forward, not back. She turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd as Mason sat frozen in place. After a long moment, he reached for the arrow, his fingers closing around the shaft. Outside, thunder rumbled across distant mountains. By mid-afternoon, dark clouds had gathered over the Montana landscape, turning day to premature dusk. Mason rode alone, the arrow secured in his saddlebag, despite his skepticism. The old woman's words about Valley Forge had disturbed him more than he cared to admit. 22 years had passed since that day. Yet the memories remained razor-sharp. The screams of civilians, the smell of gunpowder and blood, the cold eyes of Colonel Blackwood as he gave the order to fire. Mason's wife, Sarah, their young daughter, the neighbors who had sheltered them all gone in a hail of bullets meant to silence witnesses to Blackwood's weapons dealing. Only Mason had survived a bullet in his chest and vengeance in his heart. For years, he'd tracked Blackwood without success, eventually resigning himself to a half-life, a ghost drifting through frontier towns. The first heavy raindrops began to fall, drumming against Mason's hat. He urged his horse forward, seeking shelter before the storm worsened. That's when he heard it, a scream high and desperate cutting through the patter of rain. Mason reined his horse toward the sound, cresting a small rise, to see a cabin nestled in a clearing below. Smoke still rose from the chimney, but something was wrong. The front door hung askew on its hinges, and even from this distance Mason could see signs of a struggle, overturned chairs visible through the windows, items scattered across the porch. Tying his horse to a hitching post, Mason approached cautiously, his hand resting on the revolver at his hip. The rain intensified, plastering his clothes to his body as he stepped onto the porch. "Hello?" he called, one hand pushing the damaged door wider. "Anybody here need help?" A soft moan answered him. Mason stepped inside, eyes adjusting to the dim interior. The cabin showed signs of comfortable living, handmade furniture curtains at the windows, a pot of stew still simmering on the stove. But now, chaos reigned. Papers scattered across the floor, a table overturned, a kerosene lamp shattered in one corner. The moan came again. Mason turned to see a woman kneeling on the floor beside the hearth, her body bent forward in pain. Eleanor Wade was in her mid-30s, with features that would have been beautiful were they not contorted in agony. Her simple blue dress was darkened with blood around her left shoulder where an arrow protruded from her back. "Ma'am!" Mason moved toward her, then froze as her head snapped up, eyes wide with fear. "Don't!" she gasped. "Don't pull it out! I'll bleed to death. I know I will." Mason raised his hands slightly, a non-threatening gesture. "I won't touch it. Let me help you, though. You're losing blood." Eleanor's gaze held his for a long moment, assessing. Finally, she nodded, her breath coming in shallow pants. "Water in the kitchen. Clean cloths in the drawer by the sink." Mason found what she needed, bringing them back to where she knelt. Up close, he could see the arrow had punched through her shoulder, at an angle, the metal point protruding slightly below her collarbone. A killing wound if handled wrong, but not immediately fatal if treated properly. "You know about arrow wounds?" he asked carefully, tearing strips from the cloth to staunch the bleeding around the entry point. "I was a nurse during the war." Eleanor winced as he worked. "Saw too many men die from removed arrows. The barbs tear everything on the way out." Mason's hands paused momentarily. Something about this scenario, the arrow, the wounded woman, stirred an uneasy feeling. Ista's words echoed in his mind. "Today, you will meet a woman wounded by an arrow. Your fate is bound to hers." "What happened here?" he asked, resuming his work. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "They took my husband. A man named Blackwood and his gang. Said Gabriel owed gambling debts from Deadwood." Mason's blood ran cold. "Blackwood, Silas Blackwood. You know him." Eleanor searched his face. "Colonel Silas Blackwood, from the Valley Forge campaign." Eleanor nodded slowly, confusion creasing her brow. "He goes by Colonel still, though the war's been over 20 years. You fought with him." Mason's hand trembled slightly as he finished bandaging around the arrow shaft. "Against him. I was there at Valley Forge." "Your Union, then?" "Was." Mason stood moving to the window to scan the surroundings, suddenly alert for danger. "What would Colonel Blackwood want with your husband? Ma'am, gambling debts don't usually bring a man like that to your doorstep." Eleanor's laugh was bitter. "Gabriel never gambled a day in his life. It's just an excuse." "For what?" Instead of answering, Eleanor shifted position, gasping as the movement jostled the arrow. "They'll be back. Blackwood said they'd return after they finished with Gabriel." Mason's jaw tightened. "Where did they take him?" "The creek bridge, half-mile east. They—" She broke off a sob, catching in her throat. "They were going to hang him upside down, let the rising water do their work for them." Outside, the storm intensified, rain drumming against the roof like impatient fingers. Mason returned to Eleanor's side, kneeling to meet her eyes. "Mrs. Wade. Eleanor Wade." "Mrs. Wade, I need to understand what's happening. Why would Silas Blackwood come after your husband?" Eleanor studied him, seemingly weighing how much to reveal. "Who are you?" "Mason Reeves, former Lieutenant, Union Army, 18th Infantry." "The 18th?" Eleanor's eyes widened. "But they were all killed at Valley Forge. The massacre." Mason's face remained impassive. "Not all of us." A moment of understanding passed between them, the recognition of shared knowledge of secrets long buried. "Help me to that chair," Eleanor said, gesturing with her good arm. "I can't keep kneeling like this." Mason supported her weight as she rose shakily to her feet, guiding her to a sturdy wooden chair near the fire. The arrow shaft bobbed with each movement, eliciting winces of pain that Eleanor tried to suppress. Once seated, Eleanor took several steadying breaths. "My husband was a war correspondent. He was at Valley Forge the day Colonel Blackwood ordered the execution of those civilians." Mason's expression darkened. "No correspondents were there. The Army made sure of that." "Gabriel wasn't supposed to be there. He'd been embedded with another unit, got separated, stumbled onto the scene." Eleanor's fingers twisted in her lap. "He witnessed everything, hid in the woods. Took photographs." "Photographs." Mason repeated the word, heavy with implication. Eleanor nodded. "He's kept them hidden all these years, along with his journal detailing what he saw. Blackwood selling weapons to both sides, the civilian witnesses the massacre to cover it up." Mason turned away, memories surging to the surface like bloated corpses in a river. His hand instinctively reached for the scar on his chest, where Blackwood's bullet had nearly ended him. "Why now?" he asked, his voice rough. "After all these years, why would Blackwood come after your husband now?" "Because Gabriel discovered Blackwood is still doing it. Selling weapons, new repeating rifles, ammunition to settlers and native tribes alike, fueling the conflicts." Eleanor leaned forward, intensity overcoming her pain. "The attack on the Williston settlement last month, those weren't traditional weapons. The settlers were killed with modern rifles, the same ones being supplied to the cavalry." Mason's mind raced. Blackwood had always been ambitious, but this engineering conflicts to profit from both sides was a special kind of evil. "Mr. Reeves," Eleanor said, her voice dropping lower, "you should leave before they return. Blackwood won't hesitate to kill anyone connected to Valley Forge." Mason smiled grimly. "Mrs. Wade, Blackwood already killed everyone I ever loved. There's nothing left for him to take from me." Eleanor studied him, something like recognition dawning in her eyes. "You lost family there?" "My wife, my daughter, our neighbors. 47 civilians executed to protect Blackwood's secret." Sachida's voice was steady, emotionless, the grief long since calcified into something harder. "I'm sorry," Eleanor whispered. Mason acknowledged her sympathy with a slight nod. Outside, lightning flashed, momentarily brightening the cabin's interior. In that brief illumination, Mason noticed a detail he'd missed: a small photograph on the mantel showing Eleanor with a dark-haired man, presumably her husband, Gabriel. They stood in front of a newspaper office, the sign reading, "Montana Sentinel." "Your husband still works as a journalist. Editor now. The Montana Sentinel in Helena." Pride crept into Eleanor's voice, despite her pain. "He's built a reputation for exposing corruption. That's why—" The sound of approaching hoofbeats cut through the storm's rumble. Eleanor's face drained of color. "They are back," she whispered. "Sooner than I expected." Mason moved quickly to the window, peering through the rain-streaked glass. 6 riders approached the cabin, their forms indistinct through the downpour. The lead rider was unmistakable. Even after 2 decades, Silas Blackwood sat tall in the saddle, his posture military straight despite the years. 6 men, all armed. Mason reported, his mind already calculating angles, cover, potential escape routes. Blackwood leads them. Eleanor grabbed his arm with surprising strength. "Listen to me. If I don't survive this, there's a hidden cellar under the floorboards in the barn behind the hay bales. Not for the gold, for justice." "Gold?" Mason's eyebrow raised. "Blackwood found what he thinks is gold under the barn floor. That's what he believes Gabriel was hiding. But it's mostly fake painted rocks, with just enough real nuggets to be convincing. Gabriel anticipated they might come prepared a trap. The real gold is hidden in the cellar, along with something far more valuable." Before Mason could question her further, Eleanor pressed something into his palm, a faded photograph. In the dim light, he could make out Blackwood and several officers standing beside a weapons cache. On the back, written in faded ink, "Valley Forge, 1863, the massacre covered up." "This is evidence," Mason breathed, "just the beginning." Eleanor's eyes held his. "The real documentation is in the hidden cellar. Proof of everything, past and present." The hoofbeats grew louder, then stopped. Men's voices carried through the rain, the jingle of spurs on the porch steps. Mason tucked the photograph into his shirt and reached for his revolver. "Mrs. Wade, when the shooting starts, you stay down. Keep that arrow still." Eleanor shook her head. "There's a better way. Let them think you're helping me, that you know where the real gold is." Mason hesitated, then nodded. "I'll follow your lead." The door crashed open, framing a nightmare Mason had carried for 22 years. Colonel Silas Blackwood stood on the threshold, water streaming from his long black coat. At 60, his hair had gone silver, but his posture remained military erect, his blue eyes cold as a winter sky. He still wore the same meticulously groomed mustache and goatee, now white against his tanned skin. "Mrs. Wade, I see you've found company in our absence," Blackwood said, his voice cultured, almost pleasant. Then his gaze settled on Mason, and the false cordiality vanished. "Lieutenant Reeves, I was under the impression you'd died at Valley Forge." Mason kept his revolver lowered but ready. "I have similar thoughts about your conscience, Colonel." Blackwood's men filed in behind him, 5 hard-faced gunmen spreading out through the cabin's main room. One of them, a tall man with a distinctive scar running from temple to jaw, carried a bow in addition to his revolver. Mason recognized him with a jolt. Curtis Morgan, once a fellow soldier before he'd deserted to join Blackwood's command. Morgan's eyes widened slightly at the sight of Mason, but he quickly masked his surprise. "The war is over, Reeves," Blackwood said, removing his gloves with deliberate precision. "We're all civilians now." "Some of us more than others," Mason replied, his gaze steady. Blackwood smiled, revealing teeth too perfect to be real. "I see you've been tending to Mrs. Wade's injury. Unfortunate that. Morgan's arrow was meant as a warning, not a serious wound." "Seems your man's aim has deteriorated over the years," Mason said, his eyes flicking to Morgan. "The Curtis Morgan I knew could hit a playing card at 100 yards. Morgan shifted uncomfortably, but remained silent. The other men looked between Mason and their leader, sensing the undercurrent of old animosities. Blackwood moved further into the room, shrugging off his wet coat and handing it to one of his men. Despite the casual gesture, Mason noted how the colonel positioned himself away from direct lines of fire, using his men as shields. "I'm curious, Reeves. What brings you to this particular cabin on this particular day? The coincidence strains credulity." "Just passing through," Mason said. "Heard a scream, investigated. Simple as that." "Passing through." Blackwood's tone made clear his disbelief. 22 years after Valley Forge, you happen to pass through the home of the one man who has evidence of what transpired there. "Evidence?" Mason feigned confusion, though his heart hammered against his ribs. "I thought this was about gambling debts." Blackwood's laugh was genuine but cold. "Is that what Mrs. Wade told you? How charmingly naive." He crossed to where Eleanor sat, her face pale with pain, but her eyes defiant. Blackwood towered over her, studying the arrow in her shoulder with clinical detachment. "We found your husband's gold, Mrs. Wade. Quite the cache, hidden beneath the barn floor. I'm impressed." Eleanor's expression didn't change. "Then you have what you came for. Why return?" "Because gold, while valuable, isn't my primary concern." Blackwood's voice dropped lower. "Your husband possesses certain documents, photographs, journals that have more personal significance. He wouldn't give them to you," Eleanor said, each word carefully measured. "No matter what you did to him." Blackwood smiled thinly. "Everyone talks eventually, Mrs. Wade. Even the most principled journalists." Mason watched the exchange, noting how the other gunmen were positioning themselves around the cabin. One blocked the door, 2 covered the windows, another stood near the kitchen entrance. Morgan remained closest to Blackwood, his eyes occasionally darting to Mason with an unreadable expression. "The gold we found," Blackwood continued, pacing slowly before the fire, "was a clever decoy, wasn't it, Wade? Doesn't strike me as a man who'd hide his true treasure in the most obvious location." Mason decided to gamble. "Smart observation, Colonel. A man like Wade would have a better hiding place for the real gold." Eleanor shot him a quick, startled look, then composed herself. Blackwood's attention swiveled to Mason. "You know something, Lieutenant?" Mason shrugged. "Just making an observation based on the little I've learned about Mr. Wade. Seems like a careful man." "Indeed." Blackwood studied Mason through narrowed eyes. "And I suppose Mrs. Wade has been forthcoming about her husband's enterprises while you've been playing field medic." "She mentioned you hung him over the creek," Mason said, allowing an edge to enter his voice. "Said you'd be back after you finished with him." A flicker of something annoyance perhaps crossed Blackwood's face. "Mr. Wade is experiencing the consequences of his curiosity. The rising waters should be reaching his nose about now, given the intensity of this storm." Eleanor made a small sound quickly stifled. Her composure was cracking the reality of her husband's peril breaking through her brave facade. "But what truly interests me," Blackwood continued, turning back to Eleanor, "is whether his wife knows the location of his more valuable possessions. Documents from Valley Forge, perhaps." Mason saw the moment Eleanor realized Blackwood knew exactly what her husband possessed. Fear flashed across her face before she mastered it. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice remarkably steady. "No," Blackwood sighed theatrically. "How disappointing. I had hoped to avoid unnecessary unpleasantness." He nodded to Morgan. "Perhaps we should remove that arrow. Might help Mrs. Wade think more clearly." Morgan stepped forward, drawing a knife from his belt. "Wait!" Mason interjected. "You pull that arrow out wrong, she'll bleed out before she can tell you anything." Blackwood paused, considering. "You have medical expertise, Lieutenant. Enough to know barbed arrowheads do more damage coming out than going in." Mason moved closer to Eleanor, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. "Let me help her, and we'll find what you're looking for together." "Why would you assist us?" Blackwood asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. Mason met his gaze steadily. "Because Mrs. Wade doesn't deserve to die over whatever vendetta exists between you and her husband. And because I'm a practical man, 6 guns against 1 makes for poor odds." Blackwood chuckled, the sound devoid of warmth. "You always were intelligent, Reeves. Very well. See to Mrs. Wade's injury." As Mason knelt beside Eleanor, she slipped something small and cold into his palm, a key worn smooth with age. "For the cellar," she whispered, her breath warm against his ear. "Colonel," Mason said louder, "Mrs. Wade needs water and whiskey if you've got it. Arrow wounds are painful business." One of Blackwood's men produced a flask, passing it to Mason. Eleanor took a swallow when offered, coughing slightly as the liquor burned her throat. Morgan hovered nearby, watching the proceedings with visible unease. "Be careful, Colonel," he said quietly. "Reeves isn't a man to be trusted." "Your concern is noted, Morgan," Blackwood replied, his tone dismissive. "Though given your history with the lieutenant, perhaps it's not entirely objective." Mason locked eyes with Morgan briefly. The archer looked away first, shame evident in the set of his shoulders. "Colonel Blackwood," Eleanor said suddenly, her voice stronger after the whiskey. "My husband never gambled. We both know why you're really here." Blackwood raised an eyebrow. "Do we? The weapons trade. It didn't end with the war, did it?" Eleanor's eyes blazed with a mixture of pain and defiance. "You're still selling to both sides, settlers and native tribes, creating conflict for profit." A thin smile spread across Blackwood's face. "Mrs. Wade, I'm simply a businessman meeting market demands. If people wish to kill each other, who am I to deny them the tools?" "You're a monster," Eleanor spat. "I'm a pragmatist." Blackwood's voice hardened. And your husband's misguided crusade threatens American expansion. The frontier must be tamed, Mrs. Wade. That requires difficult choices. Mason positioned himself behind Eleanor, one hand on her good shoulder, the other gripping the arrow shaft. If I'm going to remove this safely, everyone needs to stand back. Give her room to breathe. Blackwood nodded to his men, who took several steps back, though their weapons remained ready. Morgan retreated to the far wall, his expression troubled. "Mrs. Wade," Mason said softly, "this will hurt. Are you ready?" Eleanor nodded, bracing herself. "Do it." Mason took a deep breath, his mind racing. Ista's words echoed in his memory. "Do not pull it out. Push it forward." The old woman's prophecy had proven eerily accurate so far. Perhaps her advice about the arrow would as well. In one smooth motion, Mason pushed the arrow forward, instead of pulling it back. The metal head punched through, completely emerging from Eleanor's chest with a sickening sound. She screamed in pain as the point embedded itself in the wooden floor, effectively pinning her in place. The room froze in collective shock. Mason used the moment of confusion to twist the arrow shaft sharply sideways, snapping it in two. The broken end in his hand became a weapon, its splintered wood now as deadly as any knife. "What the hell?" Blackwood began reaching for his revolver. Mason lunged forward, driving the broken shaft into the throat of the nearest gunman. Blood sprayed as the man fell back, clutching at the wound. In the same movement, Mason drew his own revolver, firing at the man by the door. Chaos erupted. Eleanor, freed from the arrow's anchoring, but still in agony, rolled to the side as gunfire filled the cabin. Mason dove behind an overturned table, returning fire with practiced precision. One of Blackwood's men went down a bullet hole centered in his forehead. Another staggered back, wounded in the shoulder. Morgan surprisingly held his fire, seeking cover rather than shooting at Mason. Blackwood himself had retreated to the kitchen doorway, using the wall as protection while he reloaded his ornate revolver. "Kill him!" he shouted to his remaining men. $1,000 to the man who brings me Reeves's head." Through the gun smoke and confusion, Mason saw Eleanor dragging herself toward a section of the floor near the hearth, her good arm reaching for something beneath a rug. Despite her wound, despite the blood soaking her dress, she moved with desperate purpose. A secret cellar entrance, Mason realized. The key she'd given him must be for whatever was hidden there. He provided covering fire, his shots keeping Blackwood's men at bay while Eleanor worked. 3 bullets struck the table inches from Mason's head, showering him with wooden splinters. Then something unexpected happened. Morgan, positioned near the kitchen, suddenly swiveled and fired not at Mason, but at one of his fellow gunmen who had Mason in his sights. The man crumpled, surprise etched on his features as he fell. Morgan met Mason's eyes across the room, a lifetime of regret in that single glance. "Traitor!" Blackwood roared, turning his weapon on Morgan. 2 shots rang out simultaneously. Blackwood's bullet caught Morgan in the chest, driving him back against the wall. Morgan's shot went wide, shattering a window behind the colonel. Mason used the distraction to dispatch another of Blackwood's men, leaving only the colonel and 1 gunman still standing. The odds had improved considerably. Eleanor had managed to pull back the rug, revealing a trap door in the floorboards. Her fingers fumbled with the latch, slippery with her own blood. Mason reloaded the motion automatic after decades of practice. "Mrs. Wade, get that door open. I'll cover you." The last gunman made a desperate rush at Mason, firing wildly. Mason dropped to one knee, took careful aim, and squeezed the trigger. The man's momentum carried him forward 2 more steps, before he collapsed dead before he hit the ground. Now only Blackwood remained. The colonel had retreated further into the kitchen, using the door frame as cover. His face, visible in glimpses between shots, showed not fear, but cold calculation. "Reeves," Blackwood called. "This doesn't have to end with both of us dead. I have men waiting outside." "You're lying, Blackwood," Mason replied, ejecting spent shells from his revolver and replacing them with fresh cartridges. "If you had reinforcements, they'd be in here already." A harsh laugh echoed from the kitchen. "Always the tactician. Perhaps that's why you survived Valley Forge when the others didn't." "I survived because you're a poor shot, Colonel. 22 years, and I'm still breathing." Eleanor had managed to open the trapdoor, revealing a dark space below. She looked to Mason, her face pale with blood loss, but her eyes determined. "Mr. Reeves," she called softly, "there's something you need to see." Mason risked a glance in her direction. "Is there another way out through there?" She shook her head. "No, but—" "Then stay put," Mason ordered. "This ends now." He'd waited 22 years for this moment. Silas Blackwood cornered with nowhere to run. The man who had ordered the execution of 47 civilians, including Mason's family. The man who had left Mason for dead, a bullet in his chest, and his world in ashes. "Colonel," Mason called, his voice steady, "throw out your weapon, it's over." "Nothing is over until I say it is, Lieutenant." Blackwood's voice had taken on a strange, almost amused quality. "You think this is justice? Coming for me, after all these years? I think it's overdue." "And what about Wade? While we play this little game of revenge, he drowns. The creek must be at his chin by now." Eleanor made a small, pained sound from beside the trap door. Mason kept his revolver trained on the kitchen doorway. "You're stalling, Blackwood. I'm negotiating Reeves. Let me leave and I'll tell you exactly where Wade is. Otherwise he dies, and his blood is on your hands." Before Mason could respond, movement from the trapdoor caught his eye. Incredibly, a hand emerged from the darkness below, followed by an arm, a shoulder, and finally, the mud-streaked face of Gabriel Wade. Eleanor stifled a cry of shock as her husband pulled himself from the hidden cellar. His clothes soaked and torn, his face bruised, but very much alive. Gabriel pressed a finger to his lips, signaling for silence as he eased himself fully into the cabin. The revelation struck Mason like physical blow. The hidden cellar didn't just connect to the barn, it provided an underground escape route, one Gabriel had used to elude Blackwood's men and return to the cabin. "Time's running out, Reeves," Blackwood called, unaware of the new development. "Wade is dying while you indulge your vendetta. Is that justice?" Mason caught Gabriel's eye, a silent understanding passing between them. Gabriel nodded once, then moved stealthily toward the kitchen, a revolver gripped in his mud-covered hand. "You know what, Blackwood," Mason replied, raising his voice to cover Gabriel's movements. "I've changed my mind. Tell me where Wade is, and I'll let you walk away." Blackwood's laugh was genuinely amused. "A desperate ploy, Lieutenant. I expected better from you. Last chance, Colonel. Where is Gabriel Wade?" "By now, in whatever hell awaits meddling journalists." Gabriel reached the kitchen doorway, his revolver leveled at Blackwood's back. "You might want to reconsider that assessment, Colonel," he said softly. Blackwood spun his face, registering genuine shock for the first time. "Wade, impossible. You were hanging from the bridge." Gabriel's smile was grim. "I managed to slip the ropes once your men left. The underground passage my grandfather built during the mining days proved useful." "The cellar," Blackwood breathed, understanding dawning. It connects to the creek. And to the barn, Gabriel confirmed, where, by the way, the gold you found is mostly fool's gold-painted rocks, with just enough real nuggets to be convincing. Blackwood's composure cracked slightly. The real gold is hidden elsewhere, Gabriel said, but was never the point. You know what I was really hiding. Mason had circled around during the exchange, approaching the kitchen from the opposite side. Now he stood in the doorway, his revolver aimed at Blackwood's chest. The colonel was trapped between them, his back to the kitchen wall. "Drop the gun, Colonel," Mason ordered. Blackwood's eyes darted between them, calculating his odds. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered his weapon to the floor. "Well played, gentlemen," he said, his cultured voice steady despite his predicament. "Though I wonder what you think happens next. You kill me in cold blood. That's murder, not justice." "Justice would have been a proper trial after Valley Forge," Mason replied. "Justice would have been you hanging for 47 innocent lives. This isn't justice, Blackwood. This is the past catching up with you." Gabriel moved to Eleanor's side, helping her to a chair while keeping his gun trained on Blackwood. The reunion was brief but intense. A touched hand, a look of relief, the silent communication of those who have faced death and found each other again. "The documents, Wade," Blackwood said, his eyes cold. "Where are they?" "Safe," Gabriel replied, "along with evidence of your current weapons dealing. The photographs of you selling repeating rifles to Chief Red Hawk last month were particularly damning." Blackwood's face hardened. "You don't understand the larger picture, Wade. These conflicts are inevitable. I merely profit from the inevitable." "You create the conflicts," Gabriel countered. "Arm both sides, whisper in their ears. Watch them destroy each other. Then you buy the land cheap after the bodies are buried. It's called progress, Mr. Wade. The frontier must be tamed." Mason had heard enough. "On your knees, Blackwood." The colonel raised an eyebrow. "So it's execution, then? Have you considered that I may not be working alone? That powerful men in Washington might take an interest if I disappear?" "Politicians can be exposed, too," Gabriel said. "I've made copies of everything. If anything happens to me or my wife, those documents go to every major newspaper in the country." Something shifted in Blackwood's expression, a flicker of genuine concern breaking through the arrogant facade. He sank slowly to his knees, hands raised. "You've thought of everything, haven't you, Wade?" "Not everything," Gabriel admitted. "I didn't expect you to find us so quickly. Didn't expect Eleanor to be hurt." His voice cracked slightly at this last part. Mason kept his revolver steady, watching Blackwood carefully. The colonel knelt before them, apparently defeated, yet something in his posture suggested he wasn't finished. A coiled tension, a watchful alertness that set Mason's instincts screaming. "Eleanor needs medical attention," Gabriel said, glancing at his wife. The arrow shaft still protruded from her shoulder, though Mason's unorthodox method had prevented the barbed head from causing further damage when freed. "The doctor in Whispering Pines is 3 hours' ride," Mason said, not taking his eyes off Blackwood. "In this storm, maybe longer." "There's a settlement an hour west," Gabriel countered. "Smaller, but they have a doctor." Throughout this exchange, Blackwood remained silent, his eyes calculating. Mason recognized the look, a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. "Wade," Mason said quietly, "get your wife and the documents. We need to move." Gabriel nodded, returning to the trapdoor. Eleanor struggled to her feet, grimacing with pain. "Mr. Reeves," she said, her voice weak but determined. "Thank you for everything." Mason acknowledged her gratitude with a slight nod, his focus still on Blackwood. "Thank me when we're clear of this mess, Mrs. Wade." Gabriel descended into the cellar, returning moments later with a leather satchel. "It's all here. Everything from Valley Forge plus the evidence of his current operations." Blackwood's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, a cold hatred that reminded Mason of that day 22 years ago when the colonel had ordered his men to open fire on unarmed civilians. "What now, Reeves?" Blackwood asked, his tone almost conversational. "You can't watch me every moment. Sooner or later, you'll have to decide what to do with me." "Justice will decide," Mason replied. "A proper trial this time. No military tribunal to sweep things under the rug." Blackwood's laugh was soft and knowing. "You think the government wants these secrets exposed? The weapons trades to native tribes were sanctioned, Lieutenant. Deniable, but sanctioned." "You're lying," Gabriel said sharply. "Am I?" Blackwood's smile was thin. "Check your documents again, Mr. Wade. Look for signatures on the orders. You might find some familiar names." Mason saw doubt flicker across Gabriel's face. Blackwood was sowing seeds of uncertainty, playing for time or advantage. "Enough talk," Mason said firmly. "On your feet, Colonel. You're coming with us." Blackwood rose slowly, hands still raised. "As you wish, Lieutenant. Though I wonder if—" The colonel moved with surprising speed for a man his age. His boot lashed out, kicking a fallen chair toward Mason, while his hand dropped to his waistband, drawing a derringer hidden there. Mason fired instinctively, his bullet catching Blackwood in the shoulder. The colonel staggered, but didn't fall, bringing his small pistol to bear on Eleanor. "No!" Gabriel shouted, lunging forward. 2 shots rang out simultaneously. Blackwood's derringer discharged with a sharp crack, while Gabriel's revolver boomed like thunder in the confined space. Blackwood fell backward, a red stain blossoming on his chest where Gabriel's bullet had found its mark. His own shot had gone wide, splintering the doorframe inches from Eleanor's head. For a moment, the cabin was silent, save for the rain hammering on the roof and the harsh breathing of its occupants. Blackwood lay motionless, eyes open, but unseeing the architect of so much suffering, finally still. Mason approached cautiously, kicking the derringer away before checking for a pulse. Nothing. Colonel Silas Blackwood was dead. "It's over," Mason said quietly, holstering his revolver. The words felt hollow, anticlimactic after 22 years of waiting. He'd imagined this moment countless times, Blackwood dead by his hand, vengeance for Sarah and their daughter, finally achieved. Instead, he felt only emptiness. Gabriel lowered his revolver, his face grim. "We need to get Eleanor to a doctor." Mason nodded, pushing aside his complicated emotions. "The storm's letting up. We can take my horse and one of Blackwood's. Should reach that settlement before nightfall." As Gabriel helped Eleanor toward the door, Mason knelt beside Morgan's body. The archer's eyes were still open, a question in their glazed depths. Mason reached out and closed them gently. "You chose a side in the end, Curtis," he murmured. "Too late, but you chose." Outside, the rain had indeed lessened, though the sky remained dark with clouds. The bodies of Blackwood and his men would have to wait. Eleanor's wound took priority. As Mason helped Gabriel settle Eleanor on his horse, she reached out, grasping Mason's hand. "Mr. Reeves," she said, her voice weak but clear. "The woman you lost at Valley Forge. What was her name?" The question caught Mason off guard. For a moment, he couldn't speak, the memories he'd held at bay surging forward. "Sarah," he finally answered. "My wife's name was Sarah. Our daughter was Elizabeth. She was 5. Mr. Reeves, Eleanor said, her voice weak but clear. The woman you lost at Valley Forge, what was her name? The question caught Mason off guard. For a moment, he couldn't speak the memories he'd held at bay surging forward. Sarah, he finally answered. My wife's name was Sarah Reeves. Our daughter was Elizabeth. She was 5. Eleanor nodded, as though confirming something to herself. After this is over, come to Helena with us. The Montana Sentinel could use a man with your experience. Mason managed a small smile. I'm not much of a writer, Mrs. Wade. But you're a witness, Gabriel interjected. And your testimony combined with these documents could finally bring the truth to light. Mason considered this as he mounted Blackwood's horse, the leather satchel of evidence secured to the saddle. Perhaps there was a purpose for him beyond vengeance after all. First, let's get your wife to that doctor, he said. Then we can discuss the future. As they rode away from the cabin, Mason glanced back one last time at the place where his past had finally caught up with him. Ista's prophecy had been fulfilled in ways he couldn't have imagined. The woman wounded by an arrow had indeed bound his fate to hers, leading him not just to Blackwood, but perhaps to something he'd thought forever lost a purpose. A future. The storm continued to recede as they rode west, the setting sun breaking through the clouds to cast long shadows across the Montana wilderness. Behind them lay death and retribution. Ahead, uncertain but real, lay the possibility of justice, and just maybe a kind of peace. Mason touched the broken arrow shaft he'd tucked into his belt, a reminder of Ista's wisdom. Sometimes moving forward, not back, was the only way to free oneself from pain's barbed grip. The old woman had been right about one thing more. The past was not finished with Mason Reeves. But for the first time in 22 years, neither was the future. 3 figures emerged from the shadow of the forest, their horses moving carefully along the rain-soaked trail. The settlement of Cedar Creek appeared before them as the last light faded from the sky, a small cluster of buildings promising shelter and hopefully medical care for Eleanor Wade. The small mining community of Cedar Creek consisted of little more than 24 buildings clustered around a muddy main street. Light glowed from the windows of a saloon, and a weathered sign identifying a general store creaked in the wind. At the far end stood a modest clapboard building with a small red cross painted on the door, the doctor's residence. Dr. James Fletcher was a gruff man in his 60s, with gnarled hands and eyes that had seen too much suffering. He took one look at Eleanor and motioned them inside without preamble. Arrow wound, he observed, guiding them to a back room equipped as a surgery. Don't see many of these anymore. Not since the Blackfoot troubles. Can you help her? Gabriel asked, his voice breaking. Fletcher nodded, already rolling up his sleeves. Seen worse. She's strong good chance if infection doesn't set in. He glanced at Mason. You did right not pulling it back. Most folks' panic make things worse. While the doctor worked, Mason and Gabriel waited in the front room. Gabriel paced nervously, his mud-caked clothes now dry and stiff, while Mason sat motionless by the window watching the street. She's all I have, Gabriel said, breaking a long silence. If she doesn't make it. She will? Mason interrupted. Your wife's a fighter. Gabriel paused, studying Mason with new interest. You knew Blackwood from the war. It was personal between you. It wasn't a question, but Mason answered anyway. He murdered my family at Valley Forge, ordered the execution of 47 civilians to cover up his weapons dealing. I remember, Gabriel said softly. I was there hiding in the woods. I took photographs while they lined them up. Mason's jaw tightened. You saw my wife and daughter die. Gabriel nodded, unable to meet Mason's eyes. I'm sorry I couldn't stop it. I was one man with a camera facing a firing squad. You documented it, Mason replied after a moment. That's something, more than I managed to do. Gabriel resumed his pacing. For 20 years I've been gathering evidence, building a case. Blackwood rose through the ranks after the war, made powerful connections. Taking him down required ironclad proof. And now you have it. Yes. Gabriel patted the leather satchel he'd refused to relinquish even when they'd arrived at the doctor's. Everything needed to expose not just Blackwood, but the officials who protected him. Mason absorbed this, turning to stare out the window again. Rain had given way to mist, shrouding the street in ghostly veils. A lone figure moved through the haze, a woman, her gait distinctive, despite the poor visibility. Mason leaned forward, recognition dawning. Impossible, he muttered. What is it? Gabriel moved to join him at the window. Nothing, Mason replied, but his eyes remained fixed on the street. The figure had vanished, leaving him to wonder if exhaustion was causing him to see phantoms. The surgery door opened and Dr. Fletcher emerged, wiping blood from his hands with a stained cloth. She'll live, he announced without preamble. Arrows out clean. Missed anything vital. She's young, healthy, should recover fully with time. Gabriel sagged with relief, tears threatening. Can I see her? Fletcher nodded. She's sedated but stable. You can sit with her. As Gabriel hurried into the surgery, Fletcher turned his attention to Mason. You look like you could use some attention yourself. That cut on your forehead needs stitching. Mason touched his temple, surprised to find his fingers coming away bloody. In the chaos, he hadn't noticed the injury, likely from flying splinters during the gunfight. It's nothing, he began, but Fletcher was already gathering his supplies. Sit, the doctor ordered. The lady's going to sleep through the night. You might as well let me clean you up while we wait. Mason complied, too weary to argue. As Fletcher worked applying stitches with the same efficiency he'd shown with Eleanor, Mason found himself studying the doctor's office. Certificates on the wall revealed Fletcher had trained at a prestigious Eastern medical school, a stark contrast to his current humble practice. What brought you to Cedar Creek, Doctor? Mason asked, partly from curiosity, partly to distract himself from the needle's sting. Fletcher's hands never paused. War. Same as most men our age who end up in places like this. Saw too much death in Virginia. Came west looking for something simpler. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Found it wasn't that simple after all, but by then I'd put down roots. You served with the Union, Confederate actually, field surgeon with Lee's army. Fletcher tied off the last stitch. Though out here it hardly seems to matter anymore. Dead men bleed the same color, no matter which flag they salute. Mason nodded slowly. The doctor's words echoed his own growing realization that vengeance, even when finally achieved, didn't heal the wounds of the past. Your friends, Fletcher said, packing away his instruments. They're in trouble, aren't they? That arrow wasn't a hunting accident. No, Mason admitted. It wasn't. Thought as much. Cedar Creek's small, but word travels. Colonel Blackwood's men pass through here, sometimes buying supplies, asking questions. Fletcher's eyes were shrewd. Powerful man Blackwood. Dangerous enemies to make. Mason tensed. You know Blackwood, know of him, Fletcher clarified. He controls half the territory's weapons trade, has friends in territorial government, even Washington, they say. He's dead, Mason said flatly. Killed this afternoon. Fletcher froze, his expression unreadable. I see. He resumed his work with deliberate calm. Then, your troubles are just beginning. What do you mean? Men like Blackwood don't operate alone. They have partners, subordinates, contingency plans. Fletcher closed his medical bag with a decisive snap. You should rest while you can. I suspect you'll be moving again by dawn. Mason watched the doctor retreat to an adjoining room, considering his words. Blackwood's death wouldn't end the threat. It might even accelerate it once his associates realized what had happened. Gabriel emerged from the surgery looking exhausted but relieved. She's sleeping peacefully. Doctor says the worst is over. Good, Mason replied. But we have a new problem. Blackwood's associates will be looking for us once they realize he's missing. Gabriel nodded grimly. I know. That's why I need to get to Helena as soon as possible. The documents need to be published before anyone can stop us. Helena's 2 days' hard ride from here, Mason pointed out. Your wife's in no condition to travel that distance. I know, Gabriel said, again his expression troubled. Which is why I'm going alone. I'll leave at first light, ride straight through. Eleanor will be safer here away from me until the story breaks. Mason considered this. And if Blackwood's men track you, one man alone makes an easy target. Gabriel patted the revolver at his hip. I've survived this long. Besides, Blackwood was the real threat. Without him, his operation will be in chaos, at least temporarily. Mason wasn't convinced, but he recognized the determination in Gabriel's eyes. The journalist had been working toward this moment for 20 years. Nothing would deter him now. I'll stay with your wife, Mason decided. Make sure she's protected until you can return or send for her. Relief and gratitude flooded Gabriel's features. Thank you. I won't forget this. They spent the next hour making arrangements. Gabriel would take Mason's horse, being fresher than his own, and travel light. The satchel of documents would remain on his person at all times. Mason would secure lodging for Eleanor at the small hotel adjacent to the doctor's office once she was stable enough to move. As Gabriel prepared to snatch a few hours of sleep before his dawn departure, Mason returned to his vigil by the window. The mist had thickened, obscuring most of the street, but his trained eyes detected movement near the general store across the way. A figure stood in the shadows, the same woman he'd glimpsed earlier. This time Mason didn't hesitate. He grabbed his hat and coat, stepping out into the damp night air. The woman remained motionless as he approached, almost as if she'd been waiting for him. Ista, he said, recognizing her wizened features in the faint light spilling from the store's windows. What are you doing in Cedar Creek? The old woman's dark eyes studied him. I go where I am needed, Mason Reeves. Did you know, he asked, unable to keep the edge from his voice. About Blackwood, about the Wades, did you know all of it when you gave me that arrow? Ista smiled enigmatically. I see paths, not destinations. Your path and the wounded woman's were meant to cross. What happened after was your doing, not mine. Mason wasn't satisfied. You mentioned Valley Forge. You knew about my family. I know what the spirits show me. Ista gestured toward the doctor's office. The woman will heal. Her path is long yet. And Wade, he's riding for Helena tomorrow, with evidence that could bring down powerful men. Ista's expression grew troubled. His path is shadowed. I cannot see its end clearly. Is he in danger? We are all in danger, Mason Reeves. Life itself is danger. Ista reached into her shawl, producing a small leather pouch. Give this to the wounded woman. Herbs to prevent the fever that follows arrow wounds. Mason accepted the pouch, surprised by its weight. Why are you helping us? Because the spirits whisper that what was buried at Valley Forge must finally see sunlight. Ista's gaze intensified. And because the daughter you thought lost still draws breath. Mason felt as though he'd been struck. What did you say? You're Elizabeth. She lives. That's impossible, Mason whispered, his voice hoarse. I saw her fall. The soldiers shot everyone. Not everyone, Ista countered. Some were only wounded. Some were saved. Mason grabbed her arm, heedless of propriety. Where is she? Where is my daughter? Ista didn't flinch at his grip. The path to her begins in Helena. Follow the wounded woman and her husband when the time comes. Before Mason could demand more answers, a sound from down the street caught his attention. A group of riders approached through the mist, their forms indistinct, but their purpose unmistakable. 6 men moving with military precision weapons, visible even in the poor light. Blackwood's men, Mason breathed, reaching for his revolver. Not Blackwood's anymore, Ista corrected. Now they serve another. Mason turned back to question her further, but Ista had vanished, seeming to melt into the mist itself. He cursed under his breath, then hurried back to the doctor's office to sound the alarm. Dr. Fletcher reacted with surprising composure to the news of approaching gunmen. There's a cellar, he said, already moving to roll back a rug in his examination room. Storage for medicines mostly, but it'll hide you and the lady if needed. Gabriel had armed himself the moment Mason burst through the door. We can't risk Eleanor being moved in her condition. We can't risk her being caught either, Mason countered. If those are Blackwood's men, they won't hesitate to use her against you. Fletcher exposed a trap door in the floorboards. Quickly now, I'll handle anyone who comes asking questions. Mason helped Gabriel carefully transfer the still unconscious Eleanor to the cellar. The space was cramped but clean-lined with shelves of medical supplies. A small oil lamp provided minimal light once the trapdoor closed above them. Eleanor stirred as they settled her on a pallet Fletcher had hastily arranged. Gabriel, she murmured, eyes fluttering. I'm here, he whispered, taking her hand. You're safe. The doctor removed the arrow cleanly. She managed a weak smile, then noticed their surroundings. Where are we? What's happened? Riders approaching town, Mason explained quietly. Could be Blackwood's men looking for us. Eleanor's grip on Gabriel's hand tightened. The documents. Safe, Gabriel assured her. I'm taking them to Helena at first light. Above them, they heard the doctor's door open, followed by the heavy tread of multiple boots. Muffled voices carried through the floorboards, Fletcher's calm tones interspersed with more aggressive questioning. Haven't treated any arrow wounds, they heard the doctor say, mostly mining accidents, and the usual ailments in these parts. A deeper voice responded, the words indistinct, but the tone threatening. Fletcher's reply remained measured, showing no sign of intimidation. Mason positioned himself beneath the trapdoor, revolver ready. If Fletcher gave them away, or if the searchers grew suspicious, they would have only seconds to react. Gabriel cradled Eleanor protectively, his own weapon within reach. The satchel of documents lay between them, too valuable to leave behind even momentarily. Minutes stretched like hours as the conversation continued overhead. Finally, the heavy footsteps receded, the front door closed, and silence returned. They waited tense and alert until the trap door lifted to reveal Fletcher's weathered face. They've gone, he reported. For now, but they're staying in town overnight, took rooms at the hotel. Mason holstered his revolver. Did they identify themselves? Claimed to be territorial marshals, Fletcher said with a snort. No badges, though, and I know Marshal Donovan's men by sight. These are hired guns, plain and simple. Did they mention Blackwood? Gabriel asked, as they carefully lifted Eleanor back to the examination room. Fletcher shook his head. Asked about a couple with arrow wounds or a lone man who might be injured. Said there was a reward for information. They don't know Blackwood's dead yet, Mason realized. They're operating on earlier orders to find the Wades. Which means we have a small advantage, Gabriel said, his journalist's mind quickly analyzing the situation. If I can reach Helena before they realize what's happened, they've got the hotel watched, Fletcher interrupted, and probably the livery stable too. You won't make it out of town without being spotted. Gabriel's expression fell. Their plan, already precarious, now seemed impossible. There's another way, Mason said after a moment's thought. I'll create a diversion, draw their attention while you slip out the back way. Take the doctor's horse if he's willing. You can have my old mare, Fletcher offered without hesitation. Not the fastest, but she knows the back trails better than any mount in the territory. Gabriel looked between them. And what about you, Reeves? What about Eleanor? I'll protect your wife, Mason promised, and when she's strong enough to travel, we'll follow you to Helena. Eleanor, still weak but alert, squeezed her husband's hand. Go, Gabriel. The truth about Valley Forge has waited 20 years. It can't wait any longer. The decision visibly tore at Gabriel. His mission, his life's work, pulled him toward Helena, while his heart kept him anchored to his injured wife. Finally, he nodded resolve, hardening his features. Dawn, then, he agreed. I'll be ready. Mason turned to Fletcher. Doctor, is there a back way out of town that avoids the main street? There's a deer trail behind my property that connects to the old mining road, Fletcher confirmed. Adds an hour to the journey, but keeps you out of sight until you're well clear of Cedar Creek. With their plan established, they settled in to wait for first light. Mason kept watch under the window, observing the hotel across the street, where Blackwood's men had taken rooms. Lights burned in several windows, suggesting they weren't resting, but strategizing, perhaps communicating with others in their organization, reporting their lack of success in finding the Wades. Gabriel spent the night at Eleanor's side, their heads close together, speaking in hushed tones. Mason gave them privacy, understanding these might be their last moments together for some time. The danger ahead was real, both the journey to Helena and the consequences of exposing Blackwood's operation carried significant risks. As the eastern sky began to lighten, turning from black to deep indigo, Mason roused Gabriel. It's time. The journalist nodded, kissing Eleanor's forehead one last time. I'll send word as soon as it's safe, he promised her. Be careful, she whispered, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Remember what we fought for. Gabriel shouldered the precious satchel of documents and checked his revolver one final time. Fletcher had prepared his mare, an elderly but sturdy animal, and secured minimal provisions for the journey. I'll create a distraction at the south end of town, Mason explained. Once you hear it ride north on the trail the doctor showed you. Don't stop for anything. Gabriel clasped Mason's hand. I owe you a debt I can't repay. Just get those documents published, Mason replied. That's payment enough. With a final look at Eleanor, Gabriel slipped out the back door of the doctor's residence, disappearing into the pre-dawn shadows. Mason waited 10 minutes, giving Gabriel time to reach the edge of town with Fletcher's mare. Then, pulling his hat low over his eyes, he stepped onto the muddy main street. The diversion needed to be significant enough to draw attention, but not so destructive as to harm innocent townsfolk. Mason had settled on a target during his night watch, a stack of empty barrels behind the saloon near a small shed that appeared to store kerosene for lamps. Moving casually as though he belonged, Mason crossed the street and worked his way behind the buildings. The town was still quiet, with only a few early risers visible, a shopkeeper sweeping his porch, a stable boy tending horses. The barrels were arranged haphazardly, some containing trash, others empty and awaiting use. Mason located the kerosene supply exactly where expected and quickly doused several barrels. A match struck against his boot heel provided the necessary spark. Fire caught quickly the dry wood of the barrels, crackling as flames leapt upward. Mason retreated to a safe distance, then fired his revolver into the air 3 times, a universal signal of alarm in frontier communities. "Fire!" he shouted, his voice carrying in the still morning air. "Fire at the saloon!" The effect was immediate. Doors flew open as townsfolk emerged to address the threat. Among them, Mason noted with satisfaction, were the men who had questioned Fletcher the previous night, all 6 rushing from the hotel toward the growing blaze. With the diversion in full effect, Mason circled back toward the doctor's office. He had given Gabriel the time needed to escape. Now his responsibility was to Eleanor, ensuring her safety until she could be reunited with her husband. Fletcher met him at the door, his expression grim. "That was quite a distraction." "Necessary," Mason replied, scanning the street for any sign they were being watched. "Is Mrs. Wade ready to be moved?" "Not ideally, but yes," Fletcher said. "I've prepared a wagon with a covered bed. She can lie flat for the journey." Mason raised an eyebrow. "Journey, we agreed she'd stay here until strong enough to travel." Fletcher shook his head. "Plans change. While you were setting your fire, a telegram arrived for me." He produced a yellow paper from his pocket. "It's from Helena." Mason took the telegram, scanning its brief contents. "Fletcher, stop Blackwood Associates. Aware of Wade's. Stop sending men to Cedar Creek. Stop get patients to safety. Stop Kendricks." "Who's Kendricks?" Mason asked. "My brother-in-law. Works for the territorial governor's office." Fletcher was already gathering supplies, moving with urgent efficiency. "If he's warning me, the situation is dire. Blackwood's organization is larger than we realized." Eleanor had been dressed in a clean gown, her wounded shoulder carefully bandaged and immobilized in a sling. Despite her pallor, her eyes were clear and determined. "I heard," she said, when Mason entered the examination room, "we need to leave." "You should be resting," he objected. "The journey could reopen your wound." "And staying could get us killed," she countered. "I've survived worse, Mr. Reeves." Mason recognized the same resolve he'd seen in her husband. The Wades were not people who surrendered to circumstances, no matter how dire. "Where can we go?" he asked Fletcher. "If Blackwood's men are already on their way, the main roads won't be safe." "I know a place," the doctor replied. "An old mission about 40 miles northwest of here. It's abandoned now, but the buildings are sound. More importantly, it's isolated. No one would think to look there." "A mission?" Eleanor questioned. Fletcher nodded. "Established for the Blackfoot tribe before the last conflicts drove them farther north. I treated patients there during the outbreak of '79. "How long to reach it?" Mason asked. "A full day by wagon, given Mrs. Wade's condition. We'll need to move slowly to avoid aggravating her injury." Mason considered their options, limited as they were. "The men in town will realize they've been tricked soon enough. Once the fire's controlled, they'll resume their search." "Then we'd best be gone before that happens," Fletcher said with finality. "I've already hitched my team to the wagon." Within minutes, they had Eleanor settled in the wagon's covered bed, cushioned by blankets and hidden from view. Fletcher took the reins while Mason rode alongside on one of Blackwood's horses, which they'd kept stabled behind the doctor's office. They departed Cedar Creek via the same deer trail Gabriel had used the wagon's progress, slow but steady, over the rough terrain. Behind them, smoke still rose from the saloon fire, the commotion providing continued cover for their escape. "Why are you helping us, Doctor?" Eleanor asked, as they established a steady pace on the old mining road. "You're risking a great deal." Fletcher kept his eyes on the trail ahead. Let's just say I've seen what men like Blackwood do to those who stand in their way. 20 years ago, I patched up survivors of his special operations, soldiers and civilians alike. Never sat right with me, the things that were buried. You knew about Valley Forge, Mason realized, riding closer to the wagon. Fletcher nodded grimly. Wasn't there myself, but I treated a soldier who'd been part of it, a young man who couldn't live with what he'd done. He died of his wounds, but not before unburdening his conscience. And you never reported it. Mason couldn't keep the edge from his voice. To whom? Fletcher countered. Blackwood's superiors were complicit. The war made convenient cover for all manner of sins. He glanced at Mason. I did what I could, kept records, names, dates. All these years I've wondered if the truth would ever come out. Eleanor shifted carefully in the wagon bed, wincing as the movement pulled at her wound. The real gold is safe hidden where only Gabriel and I know. But the documents, they're what truly matter. And Gabriel won't stop until Blackwood's entire network is exposed. If he makes it to Helena, Mason said softly. He will, Eleanor replied with quiet certainty. Gabriel has survived this long because he's careful, methodical. Mason hoped her faith was justified. The road to Helena was long with numerous places for ambush. Gabriel's greatest advantage was that Blackwood's men didn't yet know their employer was dead, or that Gabriel possessed evidence that could destroy their entire operation. They traveled throughout the morning, the terrain gradually changing from forest to rolling grassland. Fletcher kept them to lesser-known trails, avoiding the main road where other travelers might spot them. By midday, they had covered perhaps 15 miles slow progress, but necessary given Eleanor's condition. During a brief stop to rest the horses, Mason scouted their back trail, checking for any sign of pursuit. Finding none, he returned to the wagon where Fletcher was changing Eleanor's bandages. Clean so far, Mason reported. No sign of Blackwood's men. And the wound's holding well, Fletcher added, securing a fresh bandage over Eleanor's shoulder. No infection, minimal bleeding. You're stronger than you look, Mrs. Wade. Eleanor managed a wan smile. Necessity breeds resilience, Doctor. As Fletcher repacked his medical supplies, Mason offered Eleanor water from his canteen. She drank gratefully, then studied him with unexpected intensity. You never finished your story, she said, about Valley Forge. Mason replaced the canteen cap with deliberate care. Not much to finish. Blackwood ordered the massacre. My family died. I survived with a bullet in my chest. But why? Eleanor pressed. What made you such a threat that he needed you dead? Mason was silent for a long moment, weighing how much to reveal. Finally, he sighed. Mason's jaw tightened as he recalled events he'd rather forget. Valley Forge wasn't just a massacre. It was a calculated erasure of witnesses. Blackwood's weapons operation was too profitable to risk exposure. Eleanor studied his face, seeing the decades-old pain etched there. And you were the only survivor. A wounded soldier pulled from the killing field by someone documenting the horror, Mason said quietly. While my family and 46 others weren't so fortunate. Eleanor's eyes widened. Gabriel never mentioned. He wouldn't remember every face, Mason said. And I was barely conscious. He stopped the bleeding, left me hidden when he escaped. By the time I recovered enough to seek help, the Army had declared the incident a Confederate raid. All witnesses, dead, case closed. Except you, Eleanor pointed out. Except me, Mason agreed. And what's the testimony of one delirious soldier against a decorated officer like Blackwood? Especially when that soldier has no proof, no evidence beyond his word. Fletcher, who had been listening silently, spoke up. Yet you've hunted him all these years. Not actively, not always, Mason admitted. At first I was focused on survival, on recovering. Then there were years I tried to forget to build something new, but the ghosts remained. And now? Eleanor asked softly. Mason considered the question. With Blackwood dead, what remained of his purpose, the vengeance that had sustained him for 2 decades, had been fulfilled, yet he felt no peace, no resolution. Now, he said finally, I want justice, not just for my family, but for everyone Blackwood destroyed. That means getting your husband safely to Helena, ensuring those documents see the light of day. Eleanor nodded, accepting his answer. And after, Ista's words echoed in Mason's mind. The daughter you thought lost still draws breath. The path to her begins in Helena. After, he said, I have a new search to begin. They resumed their journey shortly thereafter, Mason riding ahead to scout the trail, while Fletcher guided the wagon at a pace that minimized jostling. The terrain grew more challenging as they approached the foothills, the trail narrowing in places where it cut between rocky outcroppings. By late afternoon, clouds had gathered again, threatening more rain. The temperature dropped, a cold wind sweeping across the grasslands. Mason pulled his coat tighter, scanning the horizon for the landmarks Fletcher had described, a distinctive twin-peaked mountain that signaled they were nearing the old mission. Movement in the distance caught his eye, not ahead, but behind them, where the trail descended into a shallow valley they had traversed an hour earlier. Mason dismounted, using a small spyglass to better observe. Riders, at least 4, moving at a steady pace along their trail. Trouble, he reported when he returned to the wagon. Riders following our path. Can't confirm it's Blackwood's men, but the timing's suspicious. Fletcher frowned, glancing at the darkening sky. We're still hours from the mission. No chance of outrunning them in the wagon. Then we stand and fight, Mason said grimly. Find a defensible position, make our stand there. No, Eleanor interjected, struggling to sit up despite her injury. That's exactly what they expect. We need another approach. Mason raised an eyebrow. I'm listening. The wagon's too slow, too visible, she reasoned. But a single rider with a passenger could move faster, take routes a wagon couldn't navigate. You're suggesting we split up, Fletcher realized. Eleanor nodded. You continue with the wagon, Doctor, making no effort to hide your trail. Mr. Reeves and I will take the horses and find another route to the mission. Your wound, Fletcher objected. The strain could reopen it. Better that risk than capture, Eleanor countered. Besides, you said yourself the worst danger is infection, and that hasn't set in. Mason considered the plan. It had merit. The pursuers would likely follow the more obvious wagon tracks, giving him and Eleanor a chance to slip away unnoticed. You'd be on your own, Doctor, he warned. If they catch up to you. I'm just a country physician, transporting supplies to an abandoned mission, Fletcher said with a shrug. Nothing suspicious about that. Except the empty wagon bed where a patient should be, Mason pointed out. Fletcher smiled thinly. I was a field surgeon in the war, Lieutenant. I know how to construct a reasonable deception. The decision made, they worked quickly to prepare. Mason helped Eleanor mount his horse, positioning her so her injured shoulder bore minimal strain. Fletcher provided additional bandages and medication, including the herbal pouch Ista had given Mason. Mix a pinch with water twice daily, Mason instructed, passing the pouch to Eleanor. The old woman who gave it to me said it prevents fever from arrow wounds. Eleanor accepted it with a curious expression. What old woman? Her name's Ista. Some kind of healer or seer. Mason adjusted the saddle, avoiding Eleanor's gaze. She predicted our meeting. Seems to know things she shouldn't. Like what? Mason hesitated, then decided truth was simpler. She said my daughter might still be alive, that the path to finding her begins in Helena. Eleanor's expression softened. Do you believe her? I don't know, Mason admitted. I saw the massacre, saw people fall, but if there's even a chance, then we have another reason to reach Helena, Eleanor said firmly. They parted ways at a fork in the trail, Fletcher continuing northwest with the wagon, while Mason and Eleanor veered northeast, taking a less direct but more concealed route toward the mission. The doctor had provided clear directions and landmarks to guide them. Mason rode behind Eleanor, supporting her with one arm while controlling the horse with the other. Her injury made the arrangement awkward, but manageable. The second horse, laden with minimal supplies, followed on a lead rope. They rode in silence for the first hour, Mason alert for any sign of pursuit, while Eleanor focused on enduring the pain each hoofbeat sent through her wounded shoulder. The trail climbed steadily into pine-covered hills, offering good visibility of the valley below. From this vantage, they spotted Fletcher's wagon continuing along the main trail. Behind it, still distant but gaining, were the riders Mason had observed earlier. Even at this distance, the military precision of their formation marked them as Blackwood's men. The doctor's plan is working, Eleanor noted. They're following him, not us. Mason nodded, though concern for Fletcher weighed on him. The doctor had voluntarily placed himself in danger to protect them, a brave act from a man who owed them nothing. As dusk approached, they reached a ridgeline that offered their first view of the abandoned mission. The cluster of adobe buildings nestled in a small valley surrounded by cottonwood trees that had been planted by the original missionaries. A creek wound past the settlement, its banks lined with willows. It looks peaceful, Eleanor observed. Let's hope it stays that way, Mason replied. We'll approach after dark, make sure it's not occupied before moving in. They made camp in a sheltered hollow building, only the smallest of fires, to ward off the evening chill. Eleanor took a dose of Fletcher's laudanum to manage the pain, then accepted a meager meal of jerky and hardtack from their supplies. Tell me about your husband, Mason said, as they ate, partly to distract Eleanor from her discomfort, partly from genuine curiosity. How did a war correspondent become editor of the Montana Sentinel? Eleanor smiled, her features softening at the mention of Gabriel. After the war, he couldn't settle back into regular reporting. What he'd seen Valley Forge, other atrocities, changed him. He became obsessed with exposing corruption, holding the powerful accountable. Not the safest career choice. No, she agreed. We moved often in those early years. Gabriel would build a reputation at a paper, publish something controversial, and suddenly we'd need to leave town. Her smile turned wistful. Helena is the longest we've stayed anywhere. Almost 3 years now. And you always a nurse? Eleanor nodded. Army hospitals during the war. That's how Gabriel and I met. He was interviewing wounded soldiers, and I was tending them. She studied Mason across the small fire. What about you? After you recovered from Valley Forge, what then? Mason poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling upward. Drifted. Tried ranching for a while in Texas. Did some scouting for the Army during the later campaigns. Nothing stuck. Because you were hunting Blackwood, Eleanor surmised. Hunting ghosts, Mason corrected. For years I had no solid information on his whereabouts, his activities. Just rumors, fragments. It wasn't until 75 that I confirmed he'd moved west, established his weapons operation in the territories. And now he's dead, Eleanor said softly. Does it feel like you expected the vengeance you sought? Mason considered the question. No, he finally admitted. I thought I'd feel something, peace, maybe, satisfaction. Instead, there's just emptiness. Because it doesn't bring them back, Eleanor said, not as a question but a statement of understanding. No, it doesn't. They fell silent, the crackling fire and distant cry of a nighthawk, the only sounds. Above them, stars emerged in a sky washed clean by the day's rain, countless and cold in their distant brilliance. If East is right, Eleanor said eventually, if your daughter is alive, what then? The question caught Mason unprepared. He'd been so focused on finding Elizabeth that he hadn't considered what would follow. She would be 27 now, a grown woman with a life of her own. Would she even remember him? Want to know him? I don't know, he admitted. I've been a ghost for so long, I'm not sure I remember how to be a father. Or anything else. Eleanor's expression was compassionate but unflinching. Then, perhaps, it's time to find out. Before Mason could respond, a sound from the direction of the mission drew their attention, voices carried on the night breeze. Male voices too distant to discern words, but clear enough to confirm they weren't alone. So much for abandoned, Mason muttered, extinguishing their small fire with dirt. Wait here. I'll scout ahead, see who we're dealing with. Eleanor caught his arm. Be careful. If they're Blackwood's men, then we find another route to Helena, he finished. Either way, I'll be back before dawn. Mason moved silently through the darkness, his years as a scout serving him well as he approached the mission. The voices grew clearer. 3 men, perhaps 4, gathered in what had once been the mission's chapel. Lamplight flickered through broken windows, casting long shadows across the overgrown courtyard. Keeping to the shadows, Mason circled the perimeter, assessing entry points and potential threats. The men appeared to be making camp, unpacking supplies, and setting up bedrolls. Their horses were tethered near a crumbling corral. Mason crept closer, positioning himself beneath a window where he could overhear their conversation. Should have caught up to them by now, one man was saying, his voice carrying an edge of frustration. Wagon can't move that fast. Maybe they split up, another suggested. Wade could have continued alone while his wife stayed behind. Blackwood's orders were clear, a third voice responded, carrying the unmistakable tone of authority. We find both Wades and recover the documents, no loose ends. And if they reach Helena, the first voice asked, once those papers are published. They won't be, the leader interrupted. Blackwood has men in Helena watching the newspaper office. Wade won't get within a block of the place. Mason tensed at this information. Gabriel was riding into a trap, unaware that Blackwood's reach extended into the territorial capital itself. What about Reeves? The second man asked. Colonel's mighty interested in him specifically. Old grudge from the war, I heard, the leader replied. Don't know the details, don't care. If we find him, we take him alive if possible. Blackwood wants that pleasure for himself. Mason suppressed a grim smile at the irony. Blackwood would be waiting a long time for that particular pleasure. He'd heard enough. These men were clearly part of Blackwood's operation, though they hadn't yet received news of their employer's death. More concerning was the revelation about Helena. Gabriel needed to be warned before he walked into an ambush. Moving carefully, Mason retreated from the mission, retracing his path through the darkness back to where Eleanor waited. She sat alert, despite her injury revolver in hand, as he approached. Blackwood's men, he reported without preamble, 4 of them making camp in the chapel. Eleanor's expression tightened. Looking for us. Yes, but they're behind events. They don't know Blackwood's dead, and they think Fletcher's wagon might still be carrying both of us. Mason knelt beside her, lowering his voice, though there was no one to overhear. There's worse news. They mentioned Blackwood has men in Helena watching the newspaper office. Gabriel's riding into a trap. Fear flashed across Eleanor's face before determination replaced it. "We need to warn him." "No direct way to do that," Mason pointed out. "He's already hours ahead riding hard for Helena." Eleanor thought for a moment, then said, "Cedar Creek has a telegraph office. If we could get a message to Helena—" "Too risky," Mason interrupted. "Blackwood might have men monitoring communications." "Then we need to reach Helena ourselves," Eleanor insisted. "Find Gabriel before he approaches the newspaper office." Mason nodded slowly. "The mission route is compromised. We'll need to find another way." "What about this Ista woman?" Eleanor suggested. "You said she helped you before. Could she help again?" "If we could find her," Mason said dubiously. "She's not exactly predictable." As if summoned by their conversation, a figure emerged from the shadows beyond their camp, a small ancient woman with a walking stick moving with surprising silence despite her age. "The path changes," Ista announced without preamble. "The man rides into danger while spirits gather at the crossroads." Mason and Eleanor exchanged startled glances. "Gabriel?" Eleanor asked, struggling to rise despite her injury. "You've seen him." Ista approached, studying Eleanor with obsidian eyes that reflected starlight. "The truth-seeker rides swift, but blind. Death waits in the city of stone." "Helena," Mason translated. "Can you help us reach him before Blackwood's men do?" Ista nodded once decisively. "There is a way, but it requires blood and memory arrows and gold." Her gaze shifted to Eleanor's wound. "And the strength to endure what comes next." Eleanor met the old woman's stare unflinchingly. "I'll endure whatever necessary to save my husband." Ista smiled, revealing teeth worn by age but still strong. "Then we begin now under the watching stars. The past and future meet at dawn, and choices made cannot be unmade." Mason looked between the two women, sensing a shift in the night's energy. Whatever Ista proposed, it went beyond simple directions or herbal remedies. There was power here, ancient and uncompromising, that demanded respect. "What do you need us to do?" he asked quietly. Ista's smile deepened her eyes, reflecting something older than the mountains surrounding them. "First, we honor the arrow that brought you together. Then we follow the eagle's cry to where paths converge." Without further explanation, she knelt beside Eleanor and reached for her wounded shoulder. "Now," she said simply, "we awaken what sleeps." And under the vast Montana sky, something ancient stirred in response to her call. Dawn broke in whispers of pink and gold across the eastern horizon. Mason awoke with a start, his hand instinctively reaching for his revolver. The events of the previous night returned in fragments: Ista's arrival, her cryptic instructions, the ceremony that followed. The old woman had created a poultice for Eleanor's wound using herbs from her medicine pouch, mixed with ashes from their fire and water from a spring only she could locate in the darkness. As she worked, she had chanted in a language Mason didn't recognize, not Blackfoot or any other tribal tongue he'd encountered during his years on the frontier. Eleanor had endured the treatment stoically, though pain etched deep lines around her eyes and mouth. When Ista finally tied off the fresh bandage, Eleanor had fallen into an exhausted sleep that bordered on unconsciousness. Now, in the pale light of morning, Mason found Eleanor still sleeping, her breathing deep and even. The fever he'd feared might develop from her wound showed no signs of manifesting. Beside her sat Ista, motionless as stone, her ancient eyes fixed on the distant mountains. "She heals," Ista said without turning. "The arrow's poison leaves her blood." Mason frowned. "Poison Morgan's arrow was poisoned, not by men's hands," Ista clarified, "by intent. Death follows Blackwood's commands, even in small things." Mason moved to check on the horses, contemplating Ista's words. He'd known Curtis Morgan as a skilled archer, but had never known him to use poisoned arrows. Then again, 20 years serving Blackwood could change a man in ways Mason couldn't imagine. "How long until she can travel?" he asked, returning to their small camp. "By midday," Ista replied. "The medicine works quickly when the spirit is strong." Mason nodded, relieved. Time was critical if they hoped to warn Gabriel before he reached Helena. "And the men at the mission?" "Gone," Ista said, finally turning to face him. "They follow false trails now, chasing shadows." "You're doing—" A hint of a smile touched Ista's weathered face. "The spirits have many voices. Some mislead those who mean harm." Mason didn't press for details. In his years on the frontier, he'd learned that some questions were better left unasked. Results mattered more than methods. Eleanor stirred her eyes, opening slowly. Confusion flickered across her features before recognition returned. "Mr. Reeves?" "Ista." Her voice was stronger than Mason expected, given her condition the previous night. "How long have I slept?" "Through the night," Mason answered, offering her water from his canteen. "How's the pain?" Eleanor cautiously rotated her injured shoulder. Surprise evident in her expression. "Less than it should be. Much less." She glanced at Ista. "Your medicine, what was in it?" "Earth's memory," the old woman replied cryptically. "And your own strength." Eleanor accepted this non-answer with remarkable equanimity. Perhaps her experiences as a nurse during the war had taught her that healing sometimes defied conventional explanation. "We need to reach Helena," she said, attempting to rise. Mason moved to assist her, impressed by her determination despite her injury. "Gabriel, we'll leave by midday," Mason assured her. "Ista says you'll be strong enough by then." Eleanor studied the old woman with new respect. "You're certain?" Ista nodded once definitively. "The wound mends, but the journey requires more than physical strength." Her obsidian eyes held Eleanor's gaze. "Are you prepared to face what waits in Helena, not just for your husband, but for yourself?" A shadow passed over Eleanor's face. "What do you mean?" "Paths that separated long ago will cross once more," Ista said. "The daughter thought lost. The father who searches. The truth buried at Valley Forge." Eleanor's eyes widened slightly, darting to Mason before returning to Ista. "You know about Mason's daughter, Elizabeth?" "I know what the spirits show me," Ista replied. "The child did not die that day. She was found taken east, given a new name. She grew into a woman who seeks the same truth her father does." Mason felt as though the ground had shifted beneath him. "My daughter is in Helena, looking for evidence about Valley Forge." Ista's expression remained impassive. "The eagle's child has her father's eyes and her mother's heart. She follows the words of the truth seeker, not knowing they lead to her own past." "Gabriel?" Eleanor breathed. "She follows Gabriel's reporting." Ista rose to her feet with surprising grace for one so aged. "Prepare to ride. The day grows older, and time runs like water through open fingers." With that cryptic pronouncement, she moved away from their camp, disappearing among the pines as silently as she had arrived. Mason and Eleanor exchanged bewildered glances. "Do you believe her?" Eleanor asked softly. "About your daughter?" Mason stared at the spot where Ista had vanished, conflicting emotions warring within him. Hope, dangerous, fragile hope, battled with the skepticism that had protected him through decades of disappointment. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "But if there's even a chance Elizabeth is alive in Helena, then we have another reason to hurry." Eleanor finished, her voice gentle but firm. They broke camp efficiently, Eleanor moving with increasing confidence as whatever healing properties Ista's treatment contained continued to work. By mid-morning they were mounted and ready to depart, taking a route east of the mission to avoid Blackwood's men. Ista had not returned, but Mason sensed her presence in the way wildlife fell silent as they passed in the faint tracks that appeared at crucial junctures to guide their way. The old woman was leading them through her own methods, visible or not. The terrain grew increasingly rugged as they climbed higher into the foothills. Pines gave way to barren slopes, where wind-twisted junipers clung tenaciously to rocky soil. The trail, more game path than proper road, wound through narrow defiles where two riders could barely pass abreast. "Gabriel won't have come this way," Eleanor observed as they picked their way carefully along a steep incline. "He'd stay to the main road, make better time." "And be more visible to anyone watching for him," Mason pointed out. "This route might be slower, but it gives us a chance to approach Helena undetected." "If we can find it at all," Eleanor said, glancing at the unfamiliar landscape. "I don't recognize any of these landmarks." "Trust Ista," Mason replied, surprised by his own confidence in the old woman's guidance. "She hasn't led us wrong yet." By midday, they had crested the range and began their descent toward the valley where Helena nestled. From their elevated position, they could see the territorial capital sprawled along the base of Mount Helena, its buildings clustered around Last Chance Gulch, where gold had first been discovered. "There," Eleanor said, pointing to a two-story brick building near the center of town. "The Montana Sentinel. Gabriel's office is on the second floor." Mason studied the layout through his spyglass. The newspaper office sat on a busy corner with clear approaches from both connecting streets. If Blackwood's men were watching the building, they'd have excellent visibility of anyone attempting to enter. "No sign of unusual activity," he reported, scanning the streets and surrounding rooftops. "But that doesn't mean they're not there." "How do we find Gabriel before he reaches the office?" Eleanor asked, the worry evident in her voice. Mason considered their options. He'd need a place to rest, clean up after the hard ride. A hotel, most likely. "The Grand Central," Eleanor said immediately. "It's where we always stay when returning from out of town." The owner is sympathetic to Gabriel's reporting. Mason located the hotel through his spyglass, a three-story structure several blocks from the newspaper office. "It's a good place to start, but we can't simply ride into town. Blackwood's men will be watching for a couple matching our description." "So we change the description," Eleanor suggested, practical even in crisis. "I still have my wedding ring. We could sell it, buy different clothes, enter town separately." Mason nodded, impressed by her strategic thinking. "There's a trading post at the edge of town. We can make our adjustments there." They continued their descent, the trail widening as it joined a more established road leading into Helena. Traffic increased, freight wagons hauling supplies, riders on various errands, the occasional stagecoach raising dust in its wake. The anonymity offered by other travelers provided welcome cover as they approached the outskirts of the territorial capital. The trading post proved ideal for their purposes. The proprietor, a grizzled former prospector named Harlan, asked no questions when Mason offered to sell one of their horses, and Eleanor discreetly removed her wedding ring. The transactions provided enough currency for new clothing and supplies. Eleanor emerged from a back room, transformed, her hair pinned up beneath a modest bonnet, her wounded shoulder concealed by a shawl draped artfully over a plain blue dress. Mason had opted for the appearance of a cattle buyer, replacing his trail-worn attire with a respectable suit and flat-brimmed hat. "Remember," Mason said as they prepared to enter Helena separately, "if Gabriel isn't at the hotel, leave a message, but don't wait. Meet me at the livery stable behind the courthouse at sunset." Eleanor nodded, her expression resolute despite the concern in her eyes. "And if Blackwood's men are already watching the hotel, then observe only. Don't approach Gabriel directly if there's any risk." Mason checked his pocket watch. Nearly 3 o'clock. Gabriel should have arrived by now if he rode through the night. He would have, Eleanor confirmed. He knows the importance of those documents. They parted ways at the edge of town, Eleanor taking the main road toward the Grand Central Hotel, while Mason circled around to approach from the north, where the courthouse and government offices stood. The afternoon crowds provided excellent cover, the streets busy with the commerce and administration of the territorial capital. Mason moved with the unhurried confidence of a man on legitimate business, nodding to passers-by while maintaining a careful awareness of his surroundings. He noted 2 men positioned at a cafe across from the newspaper office, their attentive posture and minimal conversation marking them as watchers rather than casual patrons. Blackwood's men, almost certainly. The Grand Central Hotel stood 3 blocks away, an imposing structure that catered to Helena's more affluent visitors. Mason entered casually, surveying the lobby while pretending to examine a posted stagecoach schedule. No obvious watchers here, though. That didn't mean the hotel wasn't under observation. The clerk at the front desk was a young man with meticulously combed hair and an attentive manner. Mason approached with the easy confidence of a regular guest. "Good afternoon," he began, keeping his voice conversational. "I'm supposed to meet a business associate, a newspaper man from back east. Wade, I believe. Has he checked in yet?" The clerk's expression remained professionally neutral. "I'm sorry, sir. I can't provide information about our guests." Mason slid a gold coin across the polished desk. "Of course, I understand your discretion. Perhaps you could simply let Mr. Wade know that his cattle broker has arrived, should he inquire." And the coin disappeared with practiced smoothness. "I'd be happy to pass along a message, Mr. Mason Johnson," he supplied, using the false name they had agreed upon. The clerk made a show of writing this down. "And if Mr. Wade hasn't yet arrived, then I'll check back later," Mason replied easily. "No need to trouble yourself further." As he turned to leave, Mason caught sight of Eleanor entering the lobby, playing her role perfectly as she approached the desk with the slight uncertainty of a woman traveling alone. He didn't acknowledge her, continuing toward the exit, as though they were strangers. Outside, Mason positioned himself at a tobacconist's shop with a clear view of the hotel entrance. If Gabriel was indeed staying at the Grand Central sooner or later, he would either arrive or depart. Either way, Mason intended to intercept him before he could reach the newspaper office. An hour passed with no sign of Gabriel. Mason maintained his position, purchasing a cigar to justify his lingering presence. The afternoon shadows lengthened as the sun began its westward descent behind Mount Helena. When Eleanor emerged from the hotel, her expression told Mason everything he needed to know. She didn't approach him directly, but made eye contact briefly before walking purposefully toward the courthouse. Mason waited several minutes, then followed. They met in the alley behind the livery stable as planned, concealed from casual observation by stacked hay bales and wagon parts. "No sign of him at the hotel," Eleanor confirmed in a low voice. "The maid I spoke with knows me, says Gabriel hasn't checked in, though his usual room is being held for him." Mason frowned. He should have arrived by now, even taking rest stops into account. "Unless something delayed him," Eleanor said, voicing the fear they both shared. "Or someone." "Let's not assume the worst yet," Mason cautioned, though his own concern was growing. "Fletcher's mare isn't the fastest mount. Gabriel might simply be taking longer than expected." Eleanor nodded, though worry remained etched in her features. "What's our next move?" Mason considered their options. "We need to know if Blackwood's organization is aware of his death yet. That would tell us whether they're still following his orders or operating under new leadership. How do we find that out?" The Territorial Telegraph Office, Mason decided. If Blackwood's death has been reported officially, there would be messages going back and forth to Washington. That's risky, Eleanor pointed out. Government offices are bound to be secure. Not the office itself, Mason clarified. The operator. Telegraph men know everything that passes across their wires. For the right price, they'll share what they know. The Territorial Telegraph Office was housed in a small building adjacent to the courthouse. As government employees finished their day's work and headed home, or to saloons for evening refreshment, Mason approached the side entrance where operators came and went during shift changes. His timing was perfect. A young man in shirt sleeves, ink-stained fingers suggesting hours of transcribing messages, exited the building and locked the door behind him. His weary expression brightened at the sight of the gold coin Mason casually displayed. "Evening," Mason greeted him. "Wondering if you might help me with some information. I'm expecting news about Colonel Silas Blackwood. Heard there might have been an incident at his property near Cedar Creek." The operator hesitated, professional discretion warring with the allure of easy money. "I don't know, mister. Telegraph communications are supposed to be confidential." Mason added a second coin. "I'm a friend of the family, just trying to confirm if the rumors are true before I pay my respects." The coins disappeared into the operator's pocket. "There was a flurry of messages yesterday evening," he admitted in a lowered voice. "Army dispatch to Washington reporting Blackwood's death. Found at his hunting cabin with several of his men. No details on who was responsible." "Any response from Washington?" "Instructions to secure his property and records pending arrival of Army investigators." The operator glanced around nervously. "There's been a lot of traffic about it today. Seems the colonel had some important government contracts." "I imagine so," Mason murmured. "Any messages about Gabriel Wade, the newspaper editor, or his wife?" The operator shook his head. "Not that I've seen, but I'm not on duty all hours." Mason thanked him with a third coin, then rejoined Eleanor in the shadow of the livery stable. "Blackwood's death is known," he reported. "At least officially. Army dispatches to Washington." "Then his men here in Helena must know as well," Eleanor reasoned. "They'll be operating under someone else's orders now." "Which might make them more dangerous, not less," Mason pointed out. "Whoever has taken control will want those documents even more desperately now that Blackwood can't defend himself against the allegations they contain." Eleanor's expression hardened with resolve. "Then we need to find Gabriel before they do." As darkness fell over Helena, gas lamps illuminated the main streets while secondary thoroughfares remained shrouded in shadow. Mason and Eleanor moved carefully through the town, avoiding the well-lit areas where Blackwood's watchers might be stationed. Their circuit brought them past the newspaper office, repeatedly observing from different angles. The Montana Sentinel's windows remained dark, with no sign of activity inside. The watchers Mason had noted earlier maintained their position at the cafe, now closed, but still providing a clear view of the newspaper's entrance. "He wouldn't come at night," Eleanor said as they paused in a recessed doorway across the street. "Too suspicious. He'd wait for morning arrive during normal business hours." "Unless he feared being followed," Mason countered. "Night provides cover." A sound from the alley behind them, footsteps deliberately quiet, put both on instant alert. Mason's hand moved to his concealed revolver as he positioned himself between Eleanor and the potential threat. "Mr. Reeves," a familiar voice called softly from the darkness. "Mrs. Wade." Dr. Fletcher emerged from the shadows, his medical bag in hand, looking remarkably composed despite the circumstances. "Doctor," Eleanor exclaimed in a hushed tone. "How did you find us?" "Ista," Fletcher replied simply. She said you'd be watching the newspaper office. I've been looking for you for the past hour. What happened with Blackwood's men? Mason asked, still wary, despite the doctor's familiar presence. They were following your wagon. Fletcher's expression grew grim. They caught up just before sunset yesterday. Searched the wagon, found it empty. Would have been the end of me if not for a patrol of Army regulars passing by. The soldiers recognized me. I've treated some of them before. And the men pursuing you claim to be territorial marshals searching for fugitives, Fletcher said with a snort. The patrol's lieutenant wasn't convinced, but he had no grounds to detain them. They rode off, presumably to continue their search elsewhere. You took a significant risk, Doctor, Eleanor said softly. We're grateful. Fletcher waved away her thanks. I've spent too many years watching men like Blackwood operate unchallenged. Besides, I had my own reasons for coming to Helena. He glanced around cautiously. Is there somewhere more private we can talk? What I have to tell you shouldn't be overheard. They relocated to a small boarding house on a side street where Fletcher had taken a room earlier that day. The modest accommodation offered privacy and anonymity, qualities more valuable than comfort under the circumstances. Once the door was secured, Fletcher placed his medical bag on the room's single table and withdrew a folded paper. This telegram arrived at Cedar Creek shortly after you left. It was addressed to me, but I believe it was meant for you, Mr. Reeves. Mason accepted the telegram, unfolding it carefully. The message was brief and unsigned. Daughter at Montana Sentinel. Stop working as reporter under name Elizabeth Kendricks. Stop. Valley Forge investigation. Stop. Kendricks. Mason breathed the name, striking a chord. Your brother-in-law works for the territorial governor. Fletcher nodded. My late wife's brother. He was the one who warned me about Blackwood's men coming to Cedar Creek. And my daughter works at the Sentinel. Mason could barely process the implication. With Gabriel. It appears so, Fletcher confirmed. I made inquiries when I arrived in Helena. Elizabeth Kendricks is indeed a reporter for the Sentinel specializing in government corruption. She's developed quite a reputation over the past year. Eleanor's eyes widened with sudden understanding. Gabriel has mentioned her. Says she's his most promising reporter, dedicated, fearless, especially regarding military contracts and frontier conflicts. Mason sat heavily on the room's single chair, the weight of this revelation threatening to overwhelm him. After 22 years believing his daughter dead, to discover she was not only alive, but following a path that paralleled his own quest for justice, it seemed too incredible to accept. How, he asked finally, how did she survive Valley Forge, who took her east? I don't have those answers, Fletcher admitted, but perhaps she does. She doesn't know about me, Mason realized. If she did, she would have sought me out years ago. Unless she believes you died there too, Eleanor suggested gently. Just as you believed she had. The implications cascaded through Mason's mind, years of separation, of parallel grief of a daughter who had grown to womanhood without him. What would she think of the man he had become? The drifter, the vengeful ghost, who had spent decades hunting Blackwood. We need to find Gabriel first, he said, forcing his personal turmoil aside. The documents about Valley Forge take priority. They're not just about Blackwood anymore. They're evidence of what happened to my family, to Elizabeth's mother. Eleanor touched his arm gently. We will. But Mason, you should know Gabriel would have told Elizabeth about his investigation. If she's researching Valley Forge herself, they're working together. Which means she could be in danger too, Mason said, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. If Blackwood's organization knows she's connected to the investigation, Then we find both of them, Fletcher said firmly, before Blackwood's successors do. A soft knock at the door froze them all. Fletcher motioned for Mason and Eleanor to move out of sight while he approached cautiously. "Who is it?" he called through the door. "A friend of the Eagle," came the reply, in a voice that, while youthful, carried Ista's distinctive cadence. Fletcher glanced questioningly at Mason, who nodded. The doctor opened the door to reveal a young native woman, perhaps 17, dressed in the plain clothing of a domestic servant. Her eyes, however, held the same ancient wisdom Mason had recognized in Ista. "My grandmother sends a message," she said without preamble. "The truth-seeker is hidden where waters meet stone. The daughter walks a dangerous path seeking her own ghosts." "Gabriel is hidden somewhere," Eleanor translated, stepping forward. "But Elizabeth Mason's daughter is in danger." The young woman nodded. "The men who served the dead colonel now serve another master. They watch the daughter knowing the father will come for her." Mason felt cold certainty settle in his chest. "They're using Elizabeth as bait. They know I survived Blackwood's death." "How?" Fletcher demanded. "The Army dispatch didn't mention your involvement." "Someone else survived the cabin," Mason realized. "One of Blackwood's men must have escaped, recognized me." "It doesn't matter how they know," Eleanor interjected. "What matters is that Elizabeth is in danger while Gabriel is hidden somewhere where waters meet stone. We need to find them both." The young messenger's expression remained grave. "Grandmother says to tell the Eagle this. The daughter has her mother's letters. She knows her father lives. She has searched for him as he has searched for her." Mason felt as though the floor had dropped from beneath him. "She knows about me, has been looking for me, for many years," the girl confirmed. "The man she knows as her uncle, the one you call Kendricks, has helped her search." Fletcher's expression showed surprise. "Jonathan never mentioned this to me." "He was sworn to secrecy," the messenger explained. "By the daughter herself. She feared drawing attention to her quest would endanger those who helped her." The pieces aligned in Mason's mind with sudden clarity. Blackwood. She was afraid Blackwood would kill anyone connected to Valley Forge survivors. Just as he tried to kill Gabriel when he discovered his investigation, Eleanor added softly. The young woman moved toward the door. "Grandmother says you must go to the place where stone weeps. There you will find what was lost." "Wait," Mason called as she prepared to leave. "Where is this place where stone weeps?" "The daughter knows," came the cryptic reply. "It is in her mother's last letter." With that, she slipped out into the night, leaving them with more questions than answers. "Stone weeps," Eleanor repeated thoughtfully. "It could be a waterfall. There's one at the north end of Last Chance Gulch, where the miners first found gold." "Or a natural spring emerging from rock," Fletcher suggested. "There are several in the hills around Helena." Mason paced the small room, mind racing. "If Elizabeth has been searching for me, she must have some connection to the past letters, photographs, something from Sarah. The telegram mentioned she's working on a Valley Forge investigation," Fletcher noted. "Perhaps that's how she and Gabriel connected. Their research led them to each other." "And now they're both in danger," Eleanor said, her voice tight with worry. "We need to find Elizabeth immediately. If she knows where Gabriel is hidden..." Mason came to a decision. "I'll go to the Sentinel at first light. If Elizabeth works there, she'll arrive eventually. I can intercept her before she enters Warn her." "That's exactly what Blackwood's men expect," Fletcher objected. "They're watching for you, using her as bait." "Then I'll give them what they're waiting for," Mason said grimly. "While you two find Gabriel." Eleanor shook her head firmly. "No, we stay together. Elizabeth is my best link to Gabriel, and I won't let you face Blackwood's men alone." Their debate continued into the night, strategies proposed and discarded as they considered the limited information available to them. By dawn, exhaustion had taken its toll, but a plan had emerged, one that balanced risk against their desperate need to find both Gabriel and Elizabeth before Blackwood's organization could act. As the first light of morning touched the eastern horizon, Mason stood at the window of Fletcher's room, watching the street below slowly come to life. Somewhere in Helena, his daughter, the child he had believed dead for 22 years, was preparing for her day, unaware that the father she had been searching for was finally within reach. "I'm coming, Elizabeth," he whispered to the dawn. "Just hold on a little longer." The street below remained quiet, but Mason knew the calm was deceptive. Forces were gathering, Blackwood's successors moving to protect their interests, the army investigating their former colleague's death, and somewhere in the equation, a young woman who carried Sarah's heart and Mason's determination. The final confrontation was approaching. After 22 years of hunting ghosts, Mason Reeves would soon face the most important moment of his life. Not a quest for vengeance, but a chance at redemption. A chance to reclaim what had been stolen at Valley Forge, family truth, and perhaps even a future worth living for. As Helena awakened around them, Mason, Eleanor, and Fletcher prepared to set their plan in motion. The sun rose higher, burning away the morning mist, illuminating a day that would finally bring long-buried truths to light. Somewhere in the city, stone wept its ancient tears, and there, if Ista's message held true, they would find what was lost. The dawn broke over Helena with pale golden light, illuminating a city unaware of the reckoning about to unfold within its streets. Mason, Eleanor, and Fletcher had spent the night formulating their plan, dangerous but necessary if they hoped to find Gabriel and Elizabeth before Blackwood's organization eliminated them both. "Stone weeps." Mason repeated the phrase, turning over in his mind like a river stone. Sarah used to speak of a place like that, a cave in the hills, where water dripped through the limestone, creating formations like frozen tears. Eleanor's eyes lit with recognition. The Weeping Cavern. Gabriel's written about it, an old mining tunnel that flooded abandoned after 3 men died there in 75. The locals claim it's haunted. "That's it," Fletcher confirmed. "There's an entrance about 2 miles east of town, hidden in a ravine. If someone wanted to disappear in Helena, but stay close enough to act when needed." Their plan took shape with military precision. Fletcher would create a diversion near the Montana Sentinel office, drawing the watchers' attention. Meanwhile, Eleanor would position herself to intercept Elizabeth before she arrived for work, while Mason made his way to the Weeping Cavern to find Gabriel. "If Blackwood's organization realizes what we're doing, they'll come after all of us," Mason warned. "Once we separate, we're vulnerable." Eleanor adjusted the sling supporting her injured arm, determination hardening her features. "Then we'd better move quickly." They parted in the gray half-light of early morning, each carrying the weight of what was at stake. Mason headed east, out of town, following Fletcher's directions to the hidden ravine. The path grew steeper as he climbed, more treacherous, until he found himself in a narrow gorge, where water had once carved through rock with relentless patience. The entrance to the Weeping Cavern was exactly as described, a dark mouth in the limestone face partially concealed by stunted pines. Water trickled from the rock above, creating a curtain of droplets that caught the morning light like suspended diamonds. Mason drew his revolver before entering, moving silently into the cool darkness. The sound of dripping water echoed through the passageway, creating an eerie music that seemed to come from all directions at once. 20 yards in the tunnel opened into a larger chamber, where a lantern burned low, casting long shadows across the stone floor. Gabriel Wade sat beside it, a revolver in one hand, and the leather satchel of documents clutched in the other. He looked up sharply at Mason's approach, then relaxed slightly in recognition. "Reeves," he said hoarsely, "you found me." "Your wife sent me," Mason replied, holstering his weapon. "She's in town with Fletcher. Eleanor's looking for my daughter." Gabriel's exhausted face registered surprise. "Your daughter, Elizabeth Kendricks, is your daughter." "So I'm told. I believed her dead at Valley Forge." Mason moved closer, noting the journalist's haggard appearance. "You've been here since you left Cedar Creek." Gabriel nodded, gesturing to a small camp setup, bedroll, provisions, canteen. "Blackwood's men were waiting along every approach to Helena. I nearly rode into an ambush 5 miles outside town. Pure luck. I remembered this place from an article I wrote last year." "They know you have the documents," Mason confirmed, "the evidence against Blackwood's entire operation. And now they serve a new master." Gabriel's voice turned grim. "Major William Hollister, Blackwood's partner in Washington. The telegrams I intercepted suggest he's arriving in Helena today to personally ensure everything connecting him to Blackwood is destroyed. Including us," Mason added. Gabriel opened the satchel, removing a stack of papers and photographs. This is everything: Valley Forge, the current weapons dealing, the deliberate incitement of conflicts between settlers and tribes. Names, dates, financial records." He handed several photographs to Mason, including these. Mason felt his breath catch as he examined the images the execution at Valley Forge captured with horrible clarity. In one, he could see himself rushing toward the line of civilians where Sarah stood protectively in front of their daughter. Another showed the aftermath bodies scattered across blood-soaked ground. "I've carried these for 22 years, Gabriel said quietly, waiting for the right moment, gathering more evidence, building a case that couldn't be dismissed or buried." "And Kendricks?" Mason asked. "How does he connect to Elizabeth?" "Jonathan Kendricks was an Army chaplain at Valley Forge. He found your daughter barely alive beneath her mother's body and smuggled her to safety. When no family claimed her, he and his wife raised her as their niece." Gabriel's expression softened. "They told her the truth when she was 16. She's been searching for you ever since, using her position at the paper to investigate Valley Forge without revealing her connection." A sound from the cave entrance put both men on alert. Mason drew his revolver, positioning himself between Gabriel and the potential threat. Footsteps echoed through the passage, accompanied by voices, one male, one female. "Mason!" Eleanor's familiar voice called out. "Gabriel!" "Here," Gabriel responded, relief evident in his tone. "We're here." Eleanor emerged into the chamber, supported by a young woman whose features struck Mason like a physical blow. Elizabeth had Sarah's auburn hair and graceful bearing, but the eyes that fixed on him with shocked recognition were unmistakably his own. For a moment that stretched into eternity, father and daughter regarded each other across 22 years of separation. Then Elizabeth stepped forward, her professional composure cracking as tears filled her eyes. "Lieutenant Mason Reeves," she said, her voice trembling slightly. 18th Infantry Union Army." Mason nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. "I have your letters," Elizabeth continued. "Every one you wrote to Mother during the war, and your medal for marksmanship." She reached into her pocket, producing a tarnished silver medallion. "I've carried it since I learned you might still be alive." "I thought I'd lost you both," Mason managed finally. "At Valley Forge. Uncle Jonathan Chaplain Kendricks got me out. Raised me as family when he couldn't find you." Elizabeth's composure wavered. "We looked for years. Records said you were among the dead." "Because Blackwood wanted it that way," Gabriel interjected, embracing Eleanor carefully to avoid her injured shoulder. He couldn't risk any witnesses surviving. Eleanor explained their rushed meeting outside the newspaper office, how she'd intercepted Elizabeth just as Fletcher's diversion drew away Blackwood's watchers. "We need to move quickly," she urged. "Fletcher's distraction won't hold them for long, and if Hollister is arriving today, then we need to expose everything before he can silence us." Gabriel finished. He turned to Elizabeth. "The special edition we prepared, ready to print," she confirmed. "The typesetter is standing by. Once we deliver these documents, the presses can start within the hour." Mason considered their options. Getting back to town undetected won't be easy. They'll be watching every approach to the newspaper office. "Not every approach," Elizabeth countered with a determined smile that reminded Mason painfully of Sarah. "The Sentinel's building has an old mining tunnel connecting to the basement, a relic from when the paper reported on claim disputes. The entrance is hidden behind the livery stable at the edge of town." The plan formed quickly. They would split up again, Gabriel and Elizabeth taking the documents through the hidden tunnel to start the printing process, while Mason and Eleanor created another diversion to keep Blackwood's men occupied. "And when Hollister arrives," Mason asked, "the territorial marshal will be waiting," Gabriel said. "I've been feeding him information for months. He just needed the final proof and Blackwood's death to break the organization's grip on local officials." As they prepared to leave the cave, Elizabeth hesitated, turning back to Mason. "After this is over," she said softly, "I have so many questions." "So do I," Mason replied, emotion roughening his voice. 22 years' worth. She nodded, understanding the magnitude of what lay between them. The shared loss, the parallel searches, the years that could never be reclaimed, but perhaps could be redeemed. They emerged into midday sunlight, the world continuing its indifferent rhythm, while their private drama unfolded. The path back to Helena lay before them, fraught with danger, but leading finally toward truth rather than vengeance. As they separated at the edge of town, Gabriel and Elizabeth slipping toward the hidden tunnel entrance, Mason and Eleanor heading for the prearranged diversion point, Mason felt something shift within him. The hollow space vengeance had carved during 22 years of pursuit was filling with something unexpected hope. By sunset, the Montana Sentinel's special edition flooded Helena's streets, its headline boldly proclaiming, "Valley Forge Massacre Exposed 20-Year Conspiracy of Murder and Profiteering." As citizens gathered in shocked groups to read about Blackwood's crimes, and the government officials implicated in his weapons dealing, a team of territorial marshals arrested Major William Hollister as he stepped from the eastbound train. Mason watched from across the street, Elizabeth at his side. The daughter he had thought lost forever stood tall and proud, a journalist who had helped bring truth to light, a woman who carried her mother's compassion and her father's determination. "What will you do now?" she asked, as Hollister was led away in handcuffs, his face contorted with impotent rage. Mason considered the question. For so long his existence had been defined by a single purpose, finding Blackwood. Without that driving force, who was he? What remained? "I'm not sure," he admitted. "I've been chasing ghosts for so long, I'm not certain I remember how to live among the living." Elizabeth's hand found his warm and solid and real. "Then perhaps we learn together." From the newspaper office, Gabriel and Eleanor emerged into the evening light. Eleanor's arm remained in its sling, but her face glowed with the satisfaction of justice finally served. Gabriel carried a stack of newspapers, his life's work vindicated in black and white. "The governor's office is in chaos," he reported. 3 officials have resigned already. The Army's sending investigators from Washington." "And Fletcher?" Mason asked. "Treating the wounded," Eleanor replied. There was gunfire when they arrested Hollister's men, the doctors in his element. As darkness fell over Helena, the four of them walked together toward the Grand Central Hotel. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, statements to territorial authorities, decisions about futures suddenly unburdened by the past, the careful exploration of relationships both new and renewed. But tonight, in a quiet corner of the hotel restaurant, they raised glasses in a toast. To those who didn't live to see this day, Gabriel offered. To truth finally told, added Eleanor. To family found, Elizabeth said, her eyes meeting Mason's across the table. Mason considered his own addition, the weight of 22 years of vengeance lifting from his shoulders like a physical burden set down at last. To moving forward, he said simply, not back. Outside stars emerged above Helena, countless and cold in their distant brilliance. The same stars that had witnessed the massacre at Valley Forge now witnessed its reckoning. The same stars that had watched a father and daughter torn apart now witnessed their reunion. And somewhere, Mason thought Sarah was watching too, seeing their daughter grown strong and brave, seeing justice finally served, seeing the beginnings of healing in the family that violence had shattered but could not destroy. The future stretched before them, uncertain but full of possibility. For the first time in 22 years, Mason Reeves looked toward that future not with dread or emptiness, but with hope.